What's up, everyone? This is Mike Fitch, and this is the Brute Strength Podcast. My guest today is Mike Fitch. He is the founder and president of two companies called Animal Flow and Bodyweight Athlete. Animal Flow is all about kind of coming back to connecting with your body. You know, something I talk about all the time on this show is, in terms of self-awareness, mindfulness, etc. But usually I only talk about it in the kind of mental, psychological sense. And I almost never talk about it from a physical sense, right? Being in touch with your physical sensation, with your movement. And that's what Mike is all about, right? Animal Flow is about reconnecting with your body, learning how it moves, and doing so through animal-like movements with, on all fours and stuff like that. Bodyweight Athlete is more about developing high-level skills like handstands and muscle-ups and human flags and all of that kind of stuff. This was a really great conversation because what Mike is doing with his work is all about making people slow down and progress intelligently through very complex things, and doing so while being very present with what they're doing, which is something that really, really vibes with me, and I know a lot of you as well. If you have a question that you want answered related to health and fitness, mindset, business, etc., please don't hesitate to call in. I absolutely love being able to connect with you guys and answer your questions, or having friends of mine that are experts help me answer your questions. So if you're interested, call into the hotline at 801-449-0503. That's 801-449-0503. Before we get started, if you're a regular listener of this show and haven't done so already, please head over to iTunes real quick and leave me a quick review. Enjoy the show. What's up, everyone? This is Mike Fitch, and this is the Brute Strength Podcast. We're laughing over here because we just recorded the first few minutes of this, and I realized I hadn't pressed record. So we're just going to kind of jump right into it. I want to be respectful of Mike's time. He's traveling all over the world, and he has graced us with a little bit of his time. So my first question, Mike, let's get back into this. What is Animal Flow?
Yeah. And Mike, we're going to make it through this podcast, man.
Yep.
We were joking ahead of time that we've had some schedule issues. We've had all the powers that be have been against us, but we're going to make it through. So what Animal Flow is, for those of your listeners who don't know what it is, essentially Animal Flow is a movement program that's all ground-based. And the concept of Animal Flow is, yes, there is the animal component, and we always use the kind of tagline, we mimic animals with the intention of improving the function of the human animal. And so we're always the first one to say, look, we don't take the animal part too literally. I mean, it's not necessarily about finding your spirit animal or anything like that, although it certainly could be.
Right.
But really it's about, moving your body in multiple ways through multiple planes of motion and really reconnecting with your system. And so it's another way we describe it is Animal Flow is all about communication. So how you, one, consciously communicate with your body, but how your body communicates with itself through the floor.
So you use the term reconnecting. Do you think how is that related to kind of self-awareness and becoming more aware of how your body is moving in space?
Man, 100%. So if you think about it, a lot of people, especially now in our current age, are really disconnected from their systems. And when I say disconnected, basically that means, we have a million things going on in our brains. We're so stimulated by all kinds of things, whether it's technology or stress at work or whatever. And because of that, due to that fact, a lot of times people have no spatial awareness or self-awareness of what their own body is doing. And so we kind of lose the feeling of being in our own system, and you see people walking around totally unaware of what they're doing in space, so much so that you can see someone walk out into traffic because they're either on their phone or they're, whatever. And so the issue that we see, of course, is as fitness professionals, when someone comes into the gym or the training space or the box or whatever, and they really haven't had any real connection with their system whatsoever. And then now they're ready to like come in and lift or do something intense or whatever it may be, but they haven't had any communication with their body whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And so basically we look at that and say, okay, one of the greatest places to reconnect you to your system is on the floor. And so essentially, if you think about it, in your hands and in your feet, you have a lot of sensory receptors. And essentially that just means, areas that are telling your system, information, like sending and receiving information. And so if you put your hands in your feet in contact with the same object, which is the ground, then that's rich with what would be considered proprioceptive information, which is basically that's rich awareness information that your system can use. And so when you're trying to do something to where you're coordinating both your hands and your feet at the same time against the same object, which is the floor, then you really can't be thinking about your, or anything else, because you're fully immersed in this experience. And so that's kind of what I say about reconnecting someone to their system.
I really love that analogy, and that's kind of an aha moment for me. I'm huge into meditation. I've meditated regularly for about 10 years, and so I'm very aware of how cognitively, mentally, we can be so disconnected, but I don't think nearly as much how that affects us physically. And so that analogy, it makes me think immediately of the breath, right? The breath is so simple and easy to focus on. And it just makes sense to me that getting on all fours, having all of that sensation going on through your body is very similar in the physical sense. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Or does that make sense to you?
It does. And I'm a huge advocate of both meditation and breath. And to me, I mean, those are two of the most important components, obviously oxygen, but two of the most important components as far as a physical practice that everyone should be making part of their daily regimen, which is one, even just quieting the mind, but also essentially meditation in a lot of different ways can just mean singular thought or a simple thought. And then some of that thought can also just be focusing on breath. And so a lot of times I think about animal flow or multiple other modalities as movement meditation. And so it's still a different kind of outlet of meditation to where you really are bringing your focus into your body, and you're kind of eliminating the outside noise. And I think doing that through movement just opens up a totally different experience that will only complement your stillness meditation.
Right. I've heard Ido Portal say something along the lines that as human beings, we have the kind of innate desire for the development of movement complexity, which continues to resonate with me more and more over time. And I think that applies to so many things other than movement. Why do you think that is the case with humans? Why are we wired for growth?
Well, the cool thing about our innate system is it's designed to facilitate our basic needs. And so our basic needs are the ability to feed ourselves. So, hunt, gather at one point, and mate to make sure that we continue our existence. And the funny thing about that is that we're kind of navigating now in a modern world on a very old system. And so that system would have allowed us to do all these spectacular things like hunt, run, jump, climb, swing, do all these amazing feats of physical skill, ward off an attacker and defend our family and things like that. And so we are designed to facilitate our basic needs, which are survival. However, nowadays, all we need to do is get in our car and drive to McDonald's or pick up our phone and get on Tinder, and we can eat and mate, in no time. And so essentially we've kind of outsmarted our original, our hardwiring, if you will. And so the thing is that we are master adapters. Our systems are master adapters. So whatever the task is, with enough consistency, our body will kind of rise up to meet the demands. And so we can, we have the ability to do these incredible feats of athleticism. Unfortunately, we're not usually exploring them to our actual abilities.
Right. It's It's funny because I think all of us, we really want to do those things, but we see, there's just so many temptations to be complacent, to seek comfort over progress and over growth in general, which kind of kills that entire system.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And that's the thing is we are, speaking of design, we're inherently lazy. And the reason I say that is not that we are just lazy people, but the fact is, from a physiological standpoint, our bodies are always trying to conserve energy.
Right.
Because energy is expensive, right? So basically, we try to figure out the ways to take the path of least resistance. And so if we do become emotionally kind of complacent in that thing to where we want to just do the things that are comfortable to us and or the things that we are good at, which we often see in fitness, is that the problem with that is that we're exploring and we stop growing. And that doesn't mean in a mask way, but we're not growing in our physical attributes.
And do you think this kind of leads right into my next question? I've heard you talk about the point that as humans, we should be tapping into everything that we're capable of. Why isn't it enough just to do what we can just to get through life, and so that we can do the non-physical stuff like sit at a computer, watch TV, etc.? Like, why is it important to explore our bodies, to grow, etc.?
Well, the realization is that the bodies that we're all in right now, so the body I'm in, the body you're in, the listeners are in, this is our one vessel in which we navigate our life. And so once it's all said and done, everything else that we've had as possessions, they all come and go. And the only thing that we still have left at the end of our life is our vessel. And so often we see where people just get, oh, I'm getting older, it's okay to break down. Mm-hmm. And it really is a disease of disuse. Daniel Lieberman, who wrote a book called The Story of the Human Body, really eloquently said that it's a disease of disuse, where essentially if you don't use it, you lose it. And we all have heard that, but it is so true. And so I love the idea of not accepting that we will break down at one point, but actually flourishing in the idea that if we continue to challenge ourselves, then we will kind of go past all these boundaries of what we thought originally possible. And there's just something very, very empowering about that idea, to think that this body that we're in, every day that we're in it, we can be better at it the following day. And then a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because towards the later years of your life, you may no longer be into strength training or bodybuilding or kettlebells or Olympic lifting, but you'll still be in your body. And every day that you spent getting to know your body and learning how your body works, you'll be much better for it or worse for it, depending upon how you actually worked it.
Right. So you're really challenging the assumptions that, as we get older, we have to break down, we have to get weak, we have to, lose a lot of our movement and mobility, with the idea that, we can continue improving and exploring and keep a lot of that, a lot of that physical character. Absolutely.
And it's so funny, as of recently, we've kind of started really getting popular with the mind body connection, as if they were ever two different things. They are the same thing. And what's in your mind is in your body, and what's in your body is in your mind, both physiologically and emotionally. And so if you continue to treat your body in a way that is conducive to growth, then your mind will have the same response and the same experience.
Love it, man. Can you talk about the ABCs of your program?
Yeah, essentially. So in the Animal Flow, we have 6 different components. And, just as a very, very quick kind of drive-by shooting explanation of them, one is wrist mobilizations, because if you haven't spent any time on your hands and now you're trying to spend a lot of time on your hands, we want you to be successful. So you obviously have to warm up the tissue. Second part is what we call activations. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with reconnecting someone to their system. Then there's form specific stretches, which are almost look kind of yogic in nature, but they're really about strength through motion, increasing mobility through connectivity. Then we do have the traveling forms, and that's where the ABCs come in, and I'll come back to that in a second. But then after that, we have what's called the switches and transitions, and then finally flow. And those are a lot of terms for someone that doesn't know the program, but essentially the switches and transitions are what builds the actual flow. So if you're watching someone perform an animal flow, it would look almost like a combination of gymnastics, yoga, and breakdancing. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the flow component. But if we're looking at the ABCs, we call the ABCs ape, beast, and crab. And out of those three animal locomotion patterns, they're all kind of stressing the body in a different way that's conducive to balance throughout the entire system.
I've heard you talk about, like the perfect program is the one that you stick with. What do you think are the characteristics of a system that allows people to be more consistent on it? And how do you think people can make sure that the system that they choose is something that they can stick to?
Man, I think it 100% comes down to what they enjoy. And I always kind of say, like, is animal flow the best movement system? No, it's definitely not. It's whatever you enjoy the most. So if you enjoy it the most, then it is for you. And I think there's this whole, if we step outside and we look at the entire kind of population, yes, of course, we know that obesity and disease and all of these things are prevalent in our society, and especially in the United States. And we say, okay, the people who are already into fitness. So like the people who have always been into a gym some way or another, or the people who have always kind of been on a weight loss program or not on a weight loss program, they're already in the system at some point. But mm-hmm. there's a huge population of people that just haven't even started their initiation. And so essentially you have to look at that picture and go, okay, so what is their point of entry? Because it has to be a love affair. So it has to be whenever they get into that thing, no matter what it is. So, whether it's a Zumba, whether it's animal flow, whether it's CrossFit, whether it's rock climbing, whether it's, MoveNat or something to where they're doing more outside activities, there has to be a love affair to where when they do it, they feel really great when they're doing it, or feel really great after they do it, and they want to do it more. And that's the thing with diet or exercise. I think if you tell someone they have to do something and they don't enjoy it, then their adherence to it is just not going to be as profound as it could be if they really did enjoy it. And that's why we see there's so many gadgets on infomercials. There's so many different, magazine covers. This is the key. This is the key. Mm-hmm. And the key is really about, are you going to do it or not?
I couldn't agree more, man. And going back to what we were talking about being hardwired for growth, I truly believe that each one of us wants to grow, wants to challenge ourselves, but we're surrounded by so many, silver bullet ideas and just really cozy and easy systems that are just boring, right? Like the traditional Globo gym model, it gets really boring really quickly. The traditional education system is the same way. A lot of diets, they restrict so many things, they get extremely boring. And so when we find something that allows us to grow, challenges us, has some kind of play component or a competitive component, it just, it taps into that motivation center, and it allows us to keep striving forward rather than, just feeling like we're going nowhere. And so I couldn't agree more. It's a personal journey, and hopefully everyone listening has already found that something that they love to do, that they feel like they're getting better at, and that they have room for growth, because it's the best feeling in the world when you found that thing.
Man, it really is. And then being open to the fact that it may be something totally different in 2 years' time, or 5 years' time, or a decade. And I love that freedom of going, man, I found this thing that I love now, but I'm still totally open, because I'm not going to be the same person I am now in a year's time. And all the experiences that I've gained through this one thing will maybe better prepare me for something else. And that's how I got into movement in the first place. I mean, done the entire gamut. I was a personal trainer for the time I was 19, and I spent a solid 11 years doing all strength training, all what most guys do in fitness, going through Olympic lifts, going through kettlebells, speed, agility, quickness. I eventually became a medical exercise specialist, so got into the more pre-post rehab side of things. And man, I knew I needed a change. I was a lot bigger, and I just wasn't moving well, and that really drew me to movement, man. And just getting into movement, I was so bad, and I was shocked at how poorly I was moving my own body, even though I'd spent so much time working on my body. And so, and just knowing that, man, I've had such a different relationship with my system, having experienced all these different coaches, different modalities. And I think the greatest kind of realization and the greatest truth is that everything works. Everything works for a certain person at a certain time, but what works even better is experiencing a little bit of everything.
Amen, man. I think it's funny that you said that you brought up the being open to change, and it'll make sense why I have a question for you later, like a fun question. But what do you think gets in people's way? Like, what keeps them stuck on that one thing? Why are they not able to change sometimes?
I think because change is scary, man. I think change is scary, and I think that we have a tendency to go towards the things, as I mentioned earlier, that we're good at or that feel comfortable to us. And by doing so, we're eliminating potential for growth. And I think it's hard to go into something to where you're possibly the worst person at it, and you come in, you've already built stories around it, and people are going to laugh at you, and you're going to look weak and whatever, and so basically you're going in with your own shit, and no one else has got that story about you but you. And so I think it's one of those things where I have to challenge myself, just like I would encourage everyone else to challenge themselves multiple times through their life, to just go in and be really, really bad at something and just see how it goes, man. Just see how it goes, because it may be life changing. It may be the best thing that you ever did.
I love it, man. I find myself, I find that I do that myself all the time, right? Like, I'll take rock climbing, for instance. I'm not very good at it. And for a long time, I really shied away from doing any kind of rock climbing because I just felt almost embarrassed about not being immediately great at it. And so I would just stay in the CrossFit gym, or I would stay playing ball. But the funny thing is, every single time I go rock climbing, I have a blast. It's a huge rush. I love the challenge. It's different than anything else I do. I'm completely present with, the wall, and I just have a blast. And it's exactly what you were saying. It's just that story, what will people think? What does it mean about me that I'm not great at this? And it's a very fixed way of thinking, a fixed mindset, right? Whereas someone with a growth mindset, and this is something that we talk about all the time here, someone with a growth mindset says, I'm gonna have fun with this. This is not like a measurement of how good I am as a person, or even how good I am at rock climbing, but this is an opportunity to get better.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Walking in with that, just, keep a child's mind, leave the ego behind. And that's really what it's about. Just going in and going like, look, just showing up and going, yeah, all right, so maybe I feel I'm really strong at this one thing, but I'm really shit at this other thing. And then walking in and just going, but I'm going to be okay with it. And I think that is the psychological part of that is the greatest obstacle. Because just like you said, once you get started, it's like, oh man, this is so much fun. I always feel better afterwards. I'm always like, why don't I do that more? But it's just that thing, walking in and just allowing yourself to be vulnerable.
Huge. Vulnerability, huge. Very scary, but huge.
Yeah.
Let's talk about CrossFit for a little bit.
Yeah.
What do you think long-term CrossFit athletes need to keep in mind in terms of risk and injury prevention? They're doing high reps, nearly constant loading, a lot of axial loading.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of long distance monostructural movements. What are the risks that they need to be aware of?
So, I mean, there are a couple things there. And I think the two main topics that we always kind of hear being tossed around are overstressing an already stressed system. And so you and I have already talked a bit about, you know, man, in the day and age that we're in right now, people are walking around overly sympathetic dominant. And for those of the listeners who don't know what that is, basically our autonomic nervous system. So like our nervous system has these two parts of it, sympathetic and parasympathetic. If you think about it almost like a yin and a yang, so sympathetic is going to be fight or flight. And so whenever that sympathetic system is stimulated, then all these processes take place in our body, and they prepare our body to literally do that, fight or flight. And so, you know, at one point that would be an altercation or, an attack or something like that. But now it could be the stress from our work or the stress from, our screens or whatever it may be. Whereas parasympathetic would be more feed, breed, rest, and digest. And so those two systems are always working together. And of course, we would want them to have a really nice balance to where they promote health throughout the entire system. So basically, the reason I'm laying that foundation is if someone's always maxed out in their stress levels in their life, and then they come in and they do a workout that's also super stressful, even though if it's stressful in a good way, that accumulation of stress can keep someone in an overly sympathetic state throughout their entire day, their entire life, for however long they're doing that. And so I'll come back to that in a moment, but that's one of the big key factors we hear a lot of people talking about. The other thing, of course, is the actual tissue injury, which can be, of course, one and the same. But as you had mentioned in setting up that question, which is there's a lot of structural repetition. And so, you know, one of the things that we see a lot of times in CrossFit is it's very sagittal plane dominant. And if anyone doesn't know what that is, that means basically everything's in this one plane of motion, which would be very similar to us just walking in a straight line. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the exercises that we're performing in CrossFit are very sagittal plane dominant. And the issue with that then becomes an over repetition in a region of space that we're already experiencing a lot of load there in our day-to-day life. And so basically, you know, where that begins to become problematic is if you have someone who already is not dealing very well with their load in relation to gravity. So if you have someone who has a little bit of, you know, desk jockey posture or a little bit of computer posture, or they've got kind of a bad shoulder that always rolls forward. And so every time they're walking, just that shoulder in their gait pattern or in their walking stance is always just taking abuse just from them standing and walking. And then they go in and they kind of amplify that by adding load and doing it for maximum repetition. So that may be conducive to injury. And then on top of that, you're looking at, as you mentioned again, the high repetitions. And so some of those lifts, you know, really, really neurally technical lifts that were usually done for just a handful of reps can now be done for time. And of course, the nervous system has all these strategies to like recruit the right muscles to do these movements. But once it gets really taxed, then it's just kind of throwing out all these different ways to still make the movement possible, even if it's not ideal. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that can be a very quick strategy for injury because eventually the tissue just can't take that load when not being used in an optimal strategy. So basically in saying all that, the setup for that really is that it needs to kind of come down to variability. And so if we're looking at just the stress factor first, if you have someone who's living a very stressful life and they're coming in, they're doing a CrossFit workout, fantastic. But they should also be aware of what they're doing for their parasympathetic. So what are they doing as far as, like you had mentioned, meditation? What are they doing as far as, you know, going out and having fun, just doing some play? What are they doing with some regenerative, restorative work that's maybe more mobility and stretching based? You know, what are they doing that feeds their other systems to really allow their body to find a neural balance? Then if you're also looking at the physical side, so the soft tissue side or the muscle side, what can someone do if they know that they're always doing these very kind of single plane dominant movements, what can they then do to balance out the system? So maybe they need to do more movement that has rotation in it. Maybe they need to do more movement that has more hip opening in it and getting into more extension through the spine with some sort of rotation. Maybe they need to spend more time doing myofascial work, so using their balls and getting into some more mobility and banded distractions and things like that, which I know are already part of the CrossFit community. But just spending more time on it. And so saying, okay, if I'm always going to be in this plane of motion, doing other things that would promote that are outside of that plane of motion. What can I do that allows me to replenish my system if I'm always really stressed out? And so I think my kind of answer to this very long-winded answer is finding the balance, man. And that's what it all goes back to. So if we're doing one thing really hard, we should probably also do something else really hard that's restorative. So we can only train as hard as we can regenerate.
I love that you ended with that. I a friend of mine, Bobby Maximus, used to teach stress and recovery as a system of credits and debits. And
yep.
Strength training, endurance training, any kind of training in general, half the equation is actually recovering from that stress. And if you don't have the recovery, then you're literally not rebuilding your muscle tissue or restructuring your connective tissue, or whatever change you're trying to make, you're not going to make it without the proper recovery. And I think that's so huge. And I appreciate that you made that analogy. I love that. What do you think? And so, what do you think are some simple things? I know some people are going to want some tangible things that they can take away from this show. Do you have any YouTube videos or even an archive of things that they can kind of just dip their toes in and see if they can implement some of these things that you're talking about into, say, warm-ups or cool downs, put them into the training program that they're already following?
Yeah, actually, man, if anyone listening wants to go to animalflow.com, if they go to animalflow.com, there's actually one of the tabs at the top says shop. And basically you can go in there and find the Animal Flow. It's called Animal Flow 2.0, which is just a video of some of the Animal Flow movements. But once you're there, there's 3 free samples and there's 3 movements. And the reason that we made those free is because they're such kind of big bang exercises. And so, and they're totally free and they're really nice tutorials. And one of them is on something we call a crab reach, which, man, whether you're CrossFitter or, any different style of working out, or you don't work out at all, this is going to be huge for you because it does allow you, it's a movement that's a kind of variation of a bridge. So it allows you to open up the hips, but then it also adds in this reach, which incorporates rotation and what's considered like side bending, lateral flexion, so side bending. So essentially, if you're always working or sitting in one position, this is going to be a huge kind of antidote to hours in that same position. So that's one thing. Another thing is called what we call lateral traveling ape. So it's just an ape movement, but the cool thing about it is it allows us to move in and out of a squat going sideways, which can really start to unlock some of the musculature in the hips, which a lot of people are really locked down there, especially if they're always kind of squatting in the same pattern. And then the other thing is something called an underswitch, and an underswitch is all about rotation. So it's where the legs is traveling underneath the body, putting us in beast and crab and beast and crab. And again, the cool thing about that is it's variability. So if everyone's moving kind of in the same plane of motion, it allows rotation throughout the entire system. So those are 3 really big bang movements that they can get totally for free.
And I just want to clear this up as well. We're talking about variability, and I'm sure you know this, Mike, but one of the parts of the definition of CrossFit is constant variation of time and modal domains, and modal domains meaning exercise selection. So, it is constantly varied in that fashion, but the exercise selection with 95 to 99% of gyms out there is, like Mike was saying, all in the sagittal plane. It's up and down and straight ahead. And then when we go to play soccer, or we're doing some trail running with a little bit of cutting back and forth, or we're putting something over our head in an awkward position, maybe kind of towards the side, we're not necessarily prepared for those movements because we're just not doing them on a regular basis. Add to that, you're building all of this musculature in single planes, then you have extremely strong muscles. When you go to cut side to side, you have those big, powerful muscles, but your connective tissue is not ready to go in those directions. And that's why you see so many CrossFitters and people interested in functional fitness getting injured when they go play flag football or pick up soccer or anything like that. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Mike. I love it.
Oh man, that was a great clarification. Thank you.
So another part of what you do is called global bodyweight training. What is that? And just what is that? Because I think the difference will be obvious.
So global bodyweight training, that was actually a company, more of what started as kind of like a blog first, which was really about calisthenics, just like, all right, cool. So how can you start to build your way into bodyweight training and maybe eventually get to some of the more high skilled bodyweight exercises? And so that evolved over time. And so we essentially, now we had put out a program called the Bodyweight Athlete.
That's
and
right.
Essentially that's all about, some of the big calisthenics movements that we see a lot of people posting on Instagram, or we see people really wanting to learn, like let's say a human flag or a freestanding strict handstand push-up or a muscle up, or a pistol squat or, L-sit or back lever. And we see people really just want to learn these things, and they do what most people do intuitively, which is they just go and try and do that thing. Mm-hmm. But they don't realize that there's multiple progressions that your body has to kind of go through and be successful in, to where you can now, or where you have shown that you've built the structural integrity, just like you had mentioned, not only through the muscles, but also through the connective tissue and the fascial system, to where now you can take the load of some of these exercises at such seemingly kind of odd angles. And so in that program, we show like, all right, if you want to do this thing, this is where you start. You assess your current abilities. There's also mobility components. There's movement components. There's soft tissue components. But essentially, that's what the bodyweight athlete and global bodyweight training is all about. It's all about getting someone to these very high skill exercises, but doing it in a way that's very systematic and progressive. And so
keep going.
I was just going to say, so if Animal Flow is like more of our movement program, Bodyweight Athlete is our calisthenics bodyweight strength program.
Gotcha. Can you talk a little bit more about the risk of only practicing those high level movements, and some of which would even be considered tricks like the human flag, rather than going through the progressions like you're suggesting?
Yeah. And so, it really is the difference between someone mimicking a movement and someone owning a movement. And a lot of times when you're looking at someone, and if you don't have a lot of experience with it, it's hard to tell just visually. But structurally, you can tell if you've had a little bit of experience, where you can see where, let's say over time, so let's say someone wants to learn how to do a human flag, and they just try to kick up and they try to find that position. They try to kick up, they try to find that position. And because our bodies are such incredible adaptation machines, they'll eventually be able to mimic something that looks kind of like that. However, because they haven't actually gone through the progressive overload of going from the most basic all the way to that advanced position, then now structurally their body may not be able to take that type of load for long. And I'm not saying it's always going to lead to injury. However, they're not super successful in that position. That's always the difference when you can see someone kick up and their elbows are kind of bent and they've got this really huge arc, and their feet are really disconnected from the rest of their body. And to someone that's just looking at it would be like, oh man, that's a human flag. But really it's someone mimicking a human flag. And it's of such high kind of neural load expenditure to the system. it can, again, lead to a lot of possible problems, not only with the integrity, but also possibly lead to injury. And a lot of times when people are trying to get to some of these high skill exercises, they find that they get plateaued and they can't get to a certain point. And that's exactly why, because they just haven't built the foundation for it. And their body sees it as a major threat to go any further.
I think that plateau is a huge key too. And in our world, you know, we're doing things that are sometimes not as complex as the human flag. We're doing swinging muscle ups, for instance. The goal is to be able to do 20 of those in a row, right? It's not just to do one, and we're also not judged on how it looks. So it's very easy to think, you know, if I can just do more muscle ups, that's gonna be the absolute key to getting me better. And that's definitely a component. But I think when you don't have that foundation, actually, we've seen this with hundreds or even thousands of athletes now. If you don't have that base, then you're just going to reach a ceiling that's much lower than your genetic potential, right? You're not moving as well as you could, and so you're not going to reach your potential in general. Not even to mention, you know, increase your risk for injury because you're just moving poorly.
You nailed it, man. There's so much power in what you just said, you know, and we see all the time where, you know, it's just human nature. People want to do the thing. They want to do more of the thing, and they want to get there faster. And when we see plateaus, 100% of the time, what I would almost always recommend is you need to regress in order to progress. It's just that simple. Like, you need to go back, work the structure, and then continue from there. But like, go back, work on the foundations, because there's something there that where your body, your innate system is going, I'm not allowing you to progress because I see this as potentially harmful. And we have all these really incredible self-defense mechanisms, and that's one of them. You know, it's almost like our body puts on the emergency brake because we consciously are overriding it all the time until so it has to step in and put on the brakes.
Let's move into kind of some other type of questions. Why do you think it's important to play? A lot of your movement, or even the way that you talk about movement, kind of going back to animal flow, you know, it looks playful. It looks expressive. Why do you think that's important?
Man, I think it really, you know, a lot of it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the enjoyment factor. However, also, you know, I think there is that missing component of interaction with other people and interaction with yourself that can be egoless, and they can be about the experience versus about what the intended result is. And so, you know, if you're playing, if you're having a good time, if you're smiling, if you're producing serotonin, you know, one of the greatest things is you don't realize how hard that you're working. Right. You know, when you're super tuned in and you're like, oh, I've got to get this done, I've got to complete this, I've got to accomplish this, the task at hand seems so much harder than if you were just enjoying it. And there, you know, we often do this when we do kind of like at some of the conferences I speak at, we'll do like a gamification. That's you know, we'll look at some very specifics of the movements and then say, okay, now let's do a relay race in these movements. Now let's add balloons. Now let's do mirroring games. And just the look on everyone's face and the way that they express themselves changes completely because they let all the rest of the shit go. And I think there's just that is part of the balance, you know, going back to all the things that we've been talking about, the ability to, work really hard when you need to work hard. And then also have a lot of fun when you need to have fun, lift really heavy things, lift just your body weight. You know, again, it's just going back to that balance, but play, I think, should be an important part of every person's life, no matter what the age.
Right. I love that you said what you said about it just doing it for the experience, right? Not because you're striving towards something. That's kind of like a type A ideal, you know, always trying to strive forwards and grow, but just doing it for the experience. I love that. Do you have any other ways that, or what other ways do you play in your life outside of your movement practice, and how do you encourage like spontaneity?
You I mean, I always kind of live my life by that thing of being a little bit goofy with myself, and I think there's something about not taking yourself too seriously. And whether that's in a conversation with someone else, or maybe it's just doing something totally bizarre or awkward or something that you would not normally do. But I think there is just something really cool about letting everything go and just experiencing life in different ways. And again, going around and doing things that you wouldn't normally do, and going and seeing something that you wouldn't normally see, and have a conversation with someone who really makes you laugh. And I don't know. I just think there's all these little pieces that we can start implementing that aren't of much expenditure, but can really increase our value of our existence.
I love that, man. I did a little kind of team update every couple weeks. I'll send our staff kind of an update of what I'm thinking about. And I told them something yesterday kind of along those lines. I was reading a book on, it was about memory champions, and it had this little piece about what makes, like, as we get older, it seems like our lives go by faster and faster. And part of the reason that happens is because as we get older, we're more and more in routine, right? It's more we're doing the same thing over and over and over. And so when we look back, it all just blends together, right? We don't have any anchor points. And so, one of the ways that they suggest to make life slow down, right, and be more fruitful, is to have more exciting experiences, play more, experience new things. And so then when you look back, you have all of these things, like these things that you remember doing. Oh yeah, I remember going to that park, or I remember taking that trip, or going to that amazing restaurant, or having that great conversation with that one person. So I think that's really cool that you brought that up. I love it. Can you talk about?
That's brilliant, man.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, you're so, that's such a great point of view of it does all just kind of mesh together when it's also routine. And one of my things I like to practice personally is just taking sensory snapshots, of a time, a moment. You're sitting there with some friends, you're sitting on a beach, you're watching a sunset, and just the sensory, so like taking in the sight, closing your eyes, trying to duplicate it in your eyes to really kind of ingrain it in your memory. Then like listening to the sounds, smelling the things around you and equating it with what you're picking up on. And
okay, everyone. So Mike is having some connection difficulties, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Mike, where can people find out more about what you've got going on, and where can they follow you on social media?
So animalflow.com and bodyweightathlete.com are the links for the two companies I talked about. And then on social media, Facebook, but also my Instagram is usually where I'm most active as far as kind of what's going on. That's Mike GBT. So Global Bodyweight Training, Mike GBT. So that's pretty much it, man.
Awesome, man. And of course, this final call is coming through completely clearly. And just to fill you guys in, the last few minutes, he's been having some troubles, but kind of what we were going back and forth on is this idea of just really just being more present in your day-to-day life, whether it be your movement, your relationships, your experiences in everyday life, your meditation practice, whatever it is that you're doing, being more present in that is going to, it's going to be a more enjoyable experience. It's going to make life seem like it's going by slower. And in general, that's been the theme of this entire conversation. And I really, really appreciate that, Mike. That's something that, I'm very passionate about, and that I try to embody myself. So I think it's really going to resonate with these guys. So thanks again for all your time, man. Really appreciate this. And guys, I highly, highly recommend you check out the videos that he was talking about earlier. Incorporate them into your warm-ups, into your cool downs. Even get in there into the gym and do them on a rest day, right? He talked about us being in a hyper sympathetic state, always being stressed out, constantly work without enough rest. And so I encourage you guys to play around with some of the movements he's talking about, some of the flow sessions on your rest days as well, and just see what happens. Thanks again, Mike. I really appreciate it, man.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.